The bill had barely touched the white tablecloth when my daughter-in-law slid it toward me and said, "You can pay this one too. Walter, you've always liked being useful." 8 people sat around that table, including my son, my granddaughter, and my younger sister, but not one of them laughed. I looked at the leather folder, then at Claire's hand resting beside it, perfectly still, her wedding ring catching the light from the chandelier. I had already spent $18,640 replacing the heating system in the building behind her successful therapy center, and she knew it. When I quietly mentioned that expense, her expression hardened. "We're not paying you back," she said. "You volunteered. Don't turn generosity into a debt." My son Ethan lowered his eyes. I reached beneath my chair, lifted a gray document box onto the table, and opened the lid. The first invoice inside carried a name none of them expected to see. Before I tell you what was printed on that invoice, understand that I was not a man who enjoyed keeping score. My name is Walter Bennett, and at 68, I had spent most of my adult life believing that a father's job was to stand behind his family so quietly they never noticed the weight he carried. I had managed bridge and highway projects across Ohio for nearly 4 decades, sometimes leaving home before sunrise and returning after Ethan was asleep. I missed baseball games, parent conferences, and one Christmas concert I still remembered because my late wife Margaret sat alone in the front row with an empty seat beside her. I told myself I was providing stability. Margaret rarely argued, but once, during the last year of her life, she said, "You keep solving everything with money because money never asks whether you were there." After she died, those words followed me into every silent room of our house. Ethan was 39 when he first told me about the old medical office on Hawthorne Avenue. He was a licensed physical therapist with a gift for working with children, especially those recovering from surgery or living with developmental disabilities. Claire, 3 years younger, handled scheduling, billing, marketing, and nearly every conversation involving money. She had grown up watching her parents lose a restaurant, their house, and eventually their marriage after a bankruptcy. That history had made her disciplined, ambitious, and deeply afraid of depending on anyone. I admired that about her at first. She did not wait for permission. She arrived at family dinners with spreadsheets instead of vague dreams. And when she described Bright Path Therapy Center, she had projections, staffing plans, and letters from pediatricians. Ethan brought hope. Claire brought structure. I brought the one thing the bank would not cash. When their loan application fell short, I told them I would find a way to help. The building cost $220,000, not including the repairs it needed. Its brick exterior was solid, but the roof leaked near the rear stairwell. Half the outlets dated back to the 1970s, and the parking lot cracked every winter. On the advice of my attorney, Denise Holloway, I purchased it through Bennett Property Holdings, LLC, a company I had formed years earlier for a small commercial property. Ethan and Claire signed a 5-year lease at a reduced rate, with an option to buy if the center met certain financial conditions. Denise explained every page to us in her office. Claire asked sharp questions. Ethan nodded whenever she did. I remember tapping the purchase option with my finger and saying, "One day, this place can be yours." I meant that as encouragement, not a transfer of ownership. Claire smiled and replied, "That's all we need to know." At the time, the sentence sounded grateful. 3 years later, I would hear it differently. Bright Path opened with 6 treatment rooms, a sensory gym, and more debt than Ethan liked to admit. I paid for the roof because a spring storm exposed damage their insurance would not fully cover. I paid the property taxes the first year when enrollment grew more slowly than expected. I paid for electrical upgrades after a city inspector warned that the old panel could not support new equipment. Each time, Claire promised the center would reimburse me once cash flow improved. Each time, I told her not to worry. I never asked for formal repayment schedules. I never demanded monthly statements. I called every expense an investment in Sophie's future because my 14-year-old granddaughter loved spending afternoons at the center, helping therapists clean toys and greeting children in the lobby. By the 3rd year, I had spent close to $96,000 beyond the purchase price. I kept every receipt, not because I expected repayment, but because 40 years in construction had taught me that undocumented money eventually becomes someone else's story. There were signs I should have noticed sooner. Claire insisted that contractors list BrightPath as the customer even when the checks came from my account. When I asked why, she said the expenses needed to appear in the center's records. She stopped emailing me quarterly summaries, explaining that their accountant had changed software. Ethan began answering financial questions with the same phrase Claire handles that side. Then Marcus Vale appeared. He was in his early 50s, polished without being flashy, with silver cufflinks and a way of standing too close during conversations. Claire introduced him as a growth consultant who had helped medical practices expand. The first time I met him, he spent more time studying the walls and parking lot than asking about therapy programs. A week later, I found him outside with a tape measure and a man carrying a clipboard. Claire told me they were evaluating space for a second-floor addition. I believed her because believing her was easier than admitting I had no idea what was happening inside my own building. The heating system failed during an unusually cold week in January. Claire called before dawn, saying pipes might freeze and appointments would have to be canceled. I contacted a contractor I trusted from my highway days. He installed a commercial unit, replaced damaged ductwork, and completed the work within 48 hours. The final invoice was $18,640. I paid it directly. Claire thanked me by text, adding a heart beside Sophie's name and writing that the center would make it right by summer. 2 months later, BrightPath announced its first anniversary celebration at a private dining room in downtown Columbus. Claire invited staff, relatives, and several local donors. I assumed the event meant the business was finally stable. She wore a dark blue dress. Ethan gave a speech about serving families, and Marcus stood near the bar, accepting congratulations as though he had built the place himself. I noticed that, but I said nothing. Silence had become my most expensive habit. Dinner went well, until the waiter placed the final bill in front of Claire. She did not open it. She pushed it across the table toward me with 2 fingers. "You can pay this one too." "Walter," she said, "you've always liked being useful." Linda, my 64-year-old sister, stopped lifting her wine glass. Sophie stared at her plate. Ethan cleared his throat but did not speak. I asked Claire whether she was joking. She said the center had covered the room deposit, but family expenses were different. I reminded her that I had just paid for the heating system. Her face tightened, as if I had broken an agreement by mentioning money in public. "We're not paying you back," she said. "You volunteered. Don't turn generosity into a debt." I looked at Ethan. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his napkin. That small movement told me he had heard the sentence before. Maybe they had rehearsed it. Maybe he had approved it. Either possibility hurt. I did not raise my voice. I asked the waiter to give us a moment, then walked to my car and returned with the gray document box I had brought because something in Claire's invitation had bothered me. Earlier that afternoon, a contractor had emailed me a revised copy of the heating invoice. The amount was correct, but the footer contained a line I had never seen before. I placed that invoice beside the roof repair bill and the latest property tax receipt. Claire laughed once, without humor. "Are we really doing an accounting lesson at dinner?" she asked. I ignored her and turned the pages so everyone could read them. "Look at the payment dates," I said. "Then look at the property address." Ethan leaned forward. Marcus remained near the doorway, watching. Claire reached for the heating invoice, but I placed my hand over it. The line at the bottom read, "Property collateral verification requested by Vale Capital Partners." Linda read it aloud. The room went silent. I asked Marcus why his company was verifying collateral on a building owned by Bennett Property Holdings. He smiled as though the question amused him. "That language is probably administrative," he said. "Lenders sometimes conduct preliminary reviews during expansion planning." I told him no lender had my authorization. Claire pulled the invoice from beneath my hand and studied the footer. For one brief second, her confidence disappeared. Then she recovered. "This is a contractor's mistake," she said. "You're embarrassing Ethan over paperwork you don't understand." I had spent 37 years reviewing contracts, change orders, bonds, insurance certificates, and claims involving millions of dollars. Claire knew that her insult was not meant to convince me. It was meant to convince everyone else that I had become old, emotional, and confused. Ethan finally spoke. "Dad, can we discuss this privately?" I asked whether he knew Vale Capital had been reviewing my property. He looked at Claire before answering. That look was my first real answer. Claire stood and folded her arms. "You said the building was ours." She told me. "You have said that for years." I replied that I said it could become theirs if they completed the purchase terms. She shook her head. That is not how anyone understood it. Linda reminded her that a promise of future ownership was not the same as a deed. Claire's cheeks reddened. She accused my sister of interfering in matters that did not concern her. Then she turned back to me and lowered her voice. "You gave us the building. Walter, you cannot change your mind because you feel unappreciated." The wording stopped me. She did not say I intended to give it to them. She said I had already done it. Marcus looked toward the hallway. Ethan whispered, "Claire, not here." I closed the document box and told the waiter I would pay only for myself and Linda. Then I stood. I had spent years fearing that boundaries would make me a bad father. That night, I finally understood what having none had made me. Sophie followed me into the hallway before I reached the elevator. She asked whether Bright Path was going to close. I told her I did not know. Her eyes filled, but she held herself together the way Margaret used to when she was frightened. "Mom said you wanted us to have it," she whispered. I said wanting something for someone did not mean they could take it without asking. Sophie nodded, then glanced toward the dining room. "Mr. Vale came to our house last month," she said. "He brought papers, and Mom told me to go upstairs." Before I could ask more, Ethan appeared. He told Sophie to return to the table, then faced me with a tired expression. "Please don't do anything tonight," he said. I asked what the papers were. He claimed he did not know every detail. I told him that answer was no longer acceptable. He looked as if he wanted to confess something, but Claire called his name, and he turned away. At home, I carried the document box into the study Margaret had once used for sewing. I spread the invoices across her old cutting table and began sorting them by date. The pattern was subtle. Every major expense had been described in language that made Brightpath appear to have paid or contributed the money. My checks were attached, but the summaries called them owner contributions without identifying which owner. I opened my laptop and searched the Franklin County Recorder's online portal. Bennett Property Holdings still appeared as the legal owner. For several minutes, I felt foolish for allowing dinner table language to frighten me. Then I noticed a document recorded 6 weeks earlier, memorandum of purchase option. The filing referenced Bright Path Therapy Center, Vale Capital Partners, and the Hawthorne Avenue property. I downloaded the document. The first page claimed that I had confirmed an agreement to sell the building for $275,000. The figure made no sense. The building was worth more than twice that amount after the renovations. I continued reading. The memorandum stated that Bright Path possessed an enforceable purchase right and that Vale Capital held a financial interest in that right. My name appeared on the signature page beneath Bennett Property Holdings, LLC. The electronic signature looked convincing at first glance. It used the same slanted W and compressed B I had used for decades, but whoever created it had copied the version from an old construction contract, including a small gap between my first and last name that had come from a faulty scanner. I had never signed the memorandum. I had never approved that price. I had never granted Marcus Vale any interest in my building. At 1142 that night, I called Denise Holloway and told her someone had filed a document using my signature. She asked me not to contact Ethan or Claire until she reviewed it. Then she said, "Walter, this may be bigger than a family dispute." I sat alone beneath Margaret's old brass lamp, staring at the forged-looking signature while the house settled around me. For years, I had worried that Ethan resented the father I had been. I had never imagined he might help someone use my guilt against me. Still, I was not ready to assume my son had planned any of it. Ethan avoided conflict. Claire controlled details. Marcus understood leverage. Those facts explained possibilities, not truth. I placed the heating invoice beside the recorded memorandum and saw the connection. Clearly, the contractor had not invented that collateral language. Someone had asked for verification because someone intended to use my property to secure money. The bills Claire refused to repay were no longer evidence of generosity. They were a trail showing who had funded the building, who had claimed the improvements, and who stood to profit from a sale I had never approved. I locked the documents in my fireproof cabinet. The next morning, I would begin with the county recorder, the contractor, and my son. But before sleeping, I checked one final page and found a witness name I recognized. The witness name beneath my copied signature was Ethan Bennett. I read it 3 times, hoping fatigue had rearranged the letters. But there was my son's full legal name beside a certification stating that he had watched me approve the memorandum. Ethan had not merely handed Claire a password or trusted Marcus with paperwork. According to that document, he had personally witnessed a signature I never made. I did not call him. Denise had warned me not to react before we understood what had been filed. And 37 years of managing construction disputes had taught me that anger feels powerful only until it destroys evidence. At 7 the next morning, I printed the memorandum, sealed the original invoices in an envelope, and drove to a diner near Denise's office. Ethan was already sitting in the rear booth when I arrived. Though I had not invited him, Claire had apparently told him I would be there. He looked as if he had not slept. "Dad," he said, "before you say anything, you need to understand why we did this." I sat across from him and placed the memorandum between our coffee cups. "Start with why your name is on a false witness statement," I said. Ethan stared at the page, then rubbed both hands over his face. He claimed the document Claire showed him had been different. She had described it as confirmation that their purchase option existed, something Marcus needed before investing in Bright Path. Ethan said he had signed electronically on his phone while treating patients and never saw my signature page. "You expect me to believe you witnessed a signature without seeing it?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "I trusted my wife," he replied. "You trusted Mom with paperwork for 40 years. The comparison was cruel because it was almost reasonable. Margaret had handled household bills, but she had never placed my name beneath a statement I did not make. I asked whether Vale Capital had loaned them money. Ethan said Marcus had invested $350,000 to stabilize payroll, purchase equipment, and prepare for expansion. In return, he expected Brightpath to buy the building within 18 months. I asked where they planned to get the purchase money. Ethan glanced toward the front window. "A commercial refinance," he said. "Claire said the building and the business together would support it." I reminded him that they did not own the building. "That is the part you refuse to understand," he replied, lowering his voice. "You told us it would be ours. We built the center around that promise." I asked whether a father's encouragement entitled his son to file documents behind his back. He flinched, but did not answer. Instead, he said Brightpath employed 17 people and served more than 80 children each week. If the expansion failed, Marcus could withdraw funding, the center could close, and families would lose care. Ethan spoke as though every dishonest act had been committed on behalf of those children. I recognized the argument because I had used versions of it my entire career. The project mattered. The deadline mattered. The public depended on us. Good outcomes can become excellent hiding places for bad decisions. Claire called while we were still at the diner. Ethan put the phone on speaker only after I asked him to. Her voice arrived calm and prepared. "Walter, this has gone too far," she said. "Marcus is concerned you're trying to sabotage the center over a misunderstanding." I asked whether she had authorized the memorandum. She did not deny it. She said the document merely protected rights already granted in the lease. I told her the lease required financial benchmarks, written notice, and a formal closing. She replied that my repeated promises created an expectation beyond technical language. "You cannot spend 3 years calling it their building and suddenly hide behind legal wording," she said. I asked if she had copied my signature. Her silence lasted 2 seconds. "The attorney's office handled execution," she answered. "You signed related documents before." I told her I had never authorized anyone to attach my name to that filing. Claire's tone hardened. "Then perhaps your memory is not as reliable as you believe." That sentence revealed her strategy. She did not intend to prove I had signed. She intended to make disagreement itself appear like evidence that I was aging badly. Ethan looked down at the table. I asked Claire for the name of the attorney who prepared the memorandum. She said Marcus's legal team would respond through proper channels, then accused me of threatening Sophie's future because I had been embarrassed at dinner. This is not about money, she said. It is about control. You help people so they owe you gratitude. And when they stop performing it, you punish them. I had no quick answer because part of the accusation struck something real. I had used money to remain necessary. After Margaret died, I paid for vacations, school expenses, car repairs, and improvements Ethan had not requested. Sometimes generosity had been easier than asking whether my son wanted me near him. But recognizing my weakness did not make Claire's conduct honest. Send every agreement involving the building to Denise by noon, I said. Until then, no one files another document using my name. Claire hung up. Denise reviewed the memorandum that morning. Her office overlooked the Scioto River, and she read in silence while I watched traffic cross a bridge I had helped rehabilitate 20 years earlier. She confirmed Bennett Property Holdings remained the recorded owner. The memorandum did not transfer title, but it could cloud the property by announcing that Bright Path and Vale Capital claimed an enforceable purchase interest. A lender or buyer would hesitate until the dispute was resolved. Can we remove it? I asked. Denise said we could file an affidavit disputing it and seek a court order. But immediate litigation might trigger defaults in Bright Path's financing agreements. Marcus could then seize business assets, lay off staff, and blame me publicly. Legally, you have leverage, she said. Strategically, you do not yet know where to place it. I wanted her to send a demand letter, terminate the lease, and lock the doors. Instead, she asked the question I had avoided. Do you want to protect the building, punish Claire, or save your son's business? I could not honestly say all three were still possible. By noon, no documents had arrived from Claire. Instead, a representative from Greenwell Pediatric Equipment called my cell phone and asked when I intended to pay an overdue balance of $42,300. I told him I had never ordered equipment from his company. He emailed an account summary showing Bright Path as purchaser and Walter Bennett as supporting guarantor. My home address, date of birth, and partial Social Security number appeared beneath the guarantee section. The electronic acceptance had been completed 8 months earlier. I forwarded everything to Denise. Then called Ethan. He insisted the supplier agreement should not have listed me as guarantor. Claire said your name was there only because you owned the building, he said. I asked whether he had read that agreement before signing. He became defensive. I was treating patients while she kept the place alive. He snapped. Not everyone has time to study every page. I told him that excuse sounded different when the pages contained someone else's identity. He ended the call. That afternoon, I drove to Bright Path without warning. Children's drawings covered the lobby walls, and a therapist guided a boy through balance exercises in the sensory gym. The work being done there was real. That made everything harder. Marcus was in Claire's office with a laptop open and 2 folders stacked beside him. He greeted me warmly, as if the previous evening had never happened. Walter, I'm glad you came, he said. Families sometimes confuse verbal intent with legal process. We can clean this up. I asked him directly whether Vale Capital had invested $350,000. He confirmed the amount and described it as growth capital, not a loan. In return, his firm held preferred economic rights and certain protective controls. I asked whether those controls included my building. Marcus smiled. The real estate is essential to enterprise value, he said. No serious investor would ignore it. I replied that serious investors usually verify who owns collateral before claiming an interest. His smile narrowed. Marcus showed me a transaction summary. It stated that Bright Path would purchase the property from Bennett Property Holdings for $275,000, refinance the combined business and real estate, repay Vale Capital's investment, and fund a second location. He pointed to a line identifying the difference between my purchase price and the sale price as a family equity concession. In plain language, The plan assumed I would sell a building worth approximately $610,000 for less than half its value. Claire says you intended to gift most of the equity to Ethan. Marcus explained. I asked why no one had discussed the final price with me. He replied that preliminary structures often preceded formal consent. Then the structure is fantasy. I said. Marcus closed the folder. You should consider the consequences of withdrawing support now. Your son's reputation. The staff. The children, they are all tied to this expansion. It was not a threat in wording. It was a threat in inventory. Claire entered carrying a binder and told Marcus she wanted to speak with me alone. When he left, she shut the door and stood behind her desk. You humiliated me, she said. I told her public embarrassment was not comparable to using my identity. She denied forging anything and insisted outside counsel had relied on documents from the original purchase. I asked about Greenwell pediatric equipment. Her expression shifted, but she answered quickly. The supplier required a property connection. Your name was never meant to create personal liability. I told her intentions did not change contract language. She accused me of waiting until the center became successful before reclaiming control. I looked around her office. New furniture, framed press coverage, expansion renderings, and a photograph of Marcus at a donor event covered the walls. Is it successful? I asked. She hesitated. We are growing, she said. That was not the same answer. When I requested full financial statements, she said I had no right to operational records because I was only the landlord. I left without arguing and drove to the heating contractor's office. The owner, Paul Granger, had worked with me on municipal projects for years. He remembered the collateral notation because Claire had asked his office to complete a verification form from Vail Capital. Paul showed me the email chain. The form requested confirmation that BrightPath had paid $27,900 for a comprehensive heating upgrade. Paul's office manager had refused because the actual paid invoice was $18,640. Claire then requested an expanded estimate including optional work that had never been performed. We assumed she needed it for budgeting, Paul said. The version submitted to Vail Capital combined the completed work with those optional items and presented the total as a capital improvement already funded by BrightPath. I asked whether similar requests had been made to other contractors. Paul nodded. Claire had asked him for contact information for the roofer and electrician, saying an investor needed standardized records. Back home, I placed Paul's email chain beside my invoices and began comparing the amounts. The roof replacement I had paid at $31,200 appeared in the transaction summary as $41,800. Electrical upgrades costing $16,900 were listed at $23,500. Property taxes paid directly by Bennett Property Holdings were categorized as BrightPath's owner contribution. Every difference made the center appear to have invested more capital than it actually had. Denise joined me by video call and studied the documents. This could be sloppy accounting, she said, or it could be intentional inflation used to support a valuation. I asked who benefited. She answered carefully, anyone receiving money from the proposed refinancing. We needed the full loan application, not just Marcus's summary. Without it, we could not tell whether the inflated expenses were internal projections or representations made to a bank. Denise advised me again not to confront Claire. Let them believe you're offended, she said. Do not let them know you're organized. The next morning, Linda arrived with coffee and found my dining room covered in records. She wanted me to evict Ethan immediately. They called you confused, forged your signature, and put your name on debt, she said. What more do you need? I told her children and employees would be harmed if I shut the building without a plan. Linda replied that Ethan was nearly 40, not a child. She was right. But parenthood does not end when wisdom should begin. It simply becomes less excusable. I admitted that part of me still wanted Claire to be the architect of everything so I could rescue Ethan from her. Linda shook her head. That is how you have always protected him, she said. You turn his choices into somebody else's influence. The truth of that sentence stayed with me after she left. Ethan had signed the witness statement. He had signed the supplier agreement. Whether he read them or not, his avoidance had become active participation. Later that day, Denise called and asked me to come to her office immediately. Through a banking contact authorized to review the disputed property claim, she had learned that a $900,000 commercial loan was in underwriting. The proposed proceeds would purchase the Hawthorne Avenue building, refinance BrightPath's obligations, reimburse Vail Capital, and finance a Cincinnati expansion. The loan file identified me as a supporting guarantor. Denise placed a copy of the preliminary personal financial statement on the table. It listed my retirement account balance, investment holdings, estimated home value, and cash reserves with disturbing accuracy. I had never given those figures to Claire or Marcus. Denise asked who had access to them. Margaret had once kept the records, but after her death I had shared a summary with Ethan while updating my estate plan. Only my son knew the exact balances shown on that page. I called Ethan from Denise's conference room. This time, I did not ask whether Claire had made a mistake. I read him the retirement account figure and asked where he had obtained it. The silence on the line told me he recognized the number. Finally, he said Claire had requested my financial summary 8 months earlier because Marcus wanted evidence that the family could support expansion if necessary. Ethan had taken a photograph of the estate planning worksheet from a folder in my study during Thanksgiving dinner. He insisted Claire promised it would never be submitted as a guarantee. I thought it was background, he said. I thought it would help them trust us. I asked why he had not asked me. His voice cracked. Because you would have said no. There it was, the sentence beneath every excuse. He knew I would refuse. So he helped them create the appearance that I had agreed. The betrayal was not a single document. It had been assembled piece by piece, each one small enough for Ethan to call harmless. I ended the call and looked at Denise. She said the loan could not close without additional approvals. But our immediate risk was larger than the building. If the bank believed I had knowingly supplied financial information, disputing the guarantee later could require months of litigation. My property company's credit relationships could also be affected while the matter remained unresolved. That afternoon, one of my lenders froze an unused credit line tied to a modest senior housing renovation I had agreed to support. The project manager called, embarrassed, asking whether I was involved in a family fraud dispute. News had already traveled farther than truth. I stood at Denise's window watching sunlight fade across the river and understood why Claire had spoken so confidently at dinner. She believed I would never expose them because doing so would hurt Ethan, Sophie, the center, and my own reputation. For 3 years, they had mistaken my love for permission. Now the paperwork showed that my son had helped them do it. The first thing Denise told me was not to confuse confession with innocence. Ethan had admitted taking my financial worksheet, but he still insisted he had not understood how it would be used. I wanted to believe him because disbelief would require me to accept that my only son had watched someone build a financial trap around me and decided the risk was acceptable. Denise asked for every email, text message, and attachment Ethan had received from Claire or Marcus during the previous year. Ethan resisted at first, saying patient privacy and business confidentiality were involved. Denise reminded him that his name appeared on a false witness statement and that refusing cooperation could make him look less like a careless husband and more like a willing participant. He finally agreed to meet us at her office that evening. He arrived carrying his laptop and a grocery bag filled with printed papers Claire had kept in a locked drawer. She thinks I'm at the center, he said. That sentence told me their marriage had already become another place where truth required an alibi. For 3 hours, we searched his email and messages. Most of what we found looked ordinary staffing concerns, delayed reimbursements, equipment purchases, and Marcus pushing Ethan to increase patient volume. The first important message was 8 months old. Claire had written, Marcus needs proof that Walter can support the transition if the bank asks. This does not make him liable. Ethan replied, he will say no if we ask. Claire answered, then don't ask him to make a decision he doesn't understand yet. Ethan stared at that line on the screen and whispered, I thought she meant we would explain it later. Denise asked whether he had ever explained it. He shook his head. A later message from Marcus instructed Claire to list my retirement assets under family guarantor support and said the designation could be revised before closing. That was how the trap had been built, everything temporary, preliminary, or subject to correction until the moment it became useful. Ethan had kept waiting for the honest version to replace the dishonest one. We found financial reports showing that BrightPath had never achieved the stability Claire claimed. The center had grown in patient numbers, but insurance reimbursements arrived slowly. Payroll expanded too quickly, and Marcus had encouraged them to lease expensive equipment before revenue justified it. During the first year, the center lost $83,000. In the second, it lost another $61,000. Claire covered the gaps with credit cards, short-term loans, and the money I kept supplying for property expenses. By the time Marcus invested, BrightPath was less than 6 weeks from missing payroll. Ethan said he knew they were struggling, but not by how much. Claire had shown him simplified reports that excluded certain debts. She told me cash flow was tight because we were growing. He said. Denise replied. That is technically true in the same way a house is warm while it burns. I watched Ethan absorb the humiliation of realizing he had not been treated as a partner in his own business. The emails changed the picture of Claire, though not in the way I expected. At first, she had pushed back against Marcus. In one message, she wrote, Walter is not signing a personal guarantee, and I will not expose his retirement. Marcus replied that no guarantee would be enforced unless the transaction failed. In another exchange, Claire questioned the $275,000 sale price and said the building had recently appraised near $600,000. Marcus answered, The family equity concession is what makes the capitalization work. Walter has already spent years subsidizing Ethan. We are formalizing what he intended. Claire responded only, He may not see it that way. That sentence mattered. She knew exactly how I would see it. She did not believe I had agreed. She believed my resistance could be managed. Her wrongdoing had not begun as a plan to steal my building. It had begun as a decision to postpone honesty until success made honesty unnecessary. The deeper we searched, the more Marcus's role emerged. He had offered $350,000, but only $210,000 had reached BrightPath as usable cash. The rest was categorized as consulting retainers, diligence expenses, restructuring fees, and a reserve controlled by Vail Capital. Marcus billed the center for meetings he attended as an investor. He charged monthly strategy fees while holding the authority to approve expenses. He also required Claire and Ethan to sign a control agreement allowing him to replace management if BrightPath missed 2 consecutive financial targets. Ethan claimed he had never seen that agreement. Denise found his electronic signature on the final page. He closed his eyes. Claire said it was standard investor protection. He murmured. I almost told him that grown men read documents before signing them. Then I remembered how many times I had praised him for focusing on patience while Claire handled the business. I had encouraged the very division that made his ignorance possible. Near midnight, we found the document that changed everything. It was a draft loan distribution schedule attached to an email Marcus had accidentally copied Ethan on 3 months earlier. The proposed $900,000 loan would send $275,000 to Bennett Property Holdings for the building, $350,000 to Vail Capital as repayment, $145,000 to Vail Capital as an advisory and transaction fee, $78,000 toward existing debts, and the remaining $52,000 into a restricted expansion account. BrightPath would receive almost no flexible operating cash, yet it would carry the full loan. Marcus would recover his investment, collect an additional fee, retain management rights, and leave Ethan and Claire responsible for debt secured by a building they had acquired at an artificially low price. Denise looked at the schedule and said, This is not rescue financing. It is an extraction. Ethan stared at the numbers as though they were written in another language. Claire had gambled the center to save it, and Marcus had designed the gamble so he won whether the center survived or failed. The next morning, I met Claire alone at a coffee shop near BrightPath. I did not tell her what we had found. I asked why she had accepted Marcus's terms. She looked exhausted, not triumphant. Without the polished office and controlled lighting, she appeared younger and more frightened. Because no one else would invest, she said. She described the months when payroll was due and insurance payments were delayed, when therapists asked whether their checks would clear, and when Ethan continued promising families new programs without understanding the cost. She said she had sold jewelry, borrowed against their home equity, and hidden bills because Ethan shut down whenever she discussed failure. Your son is wonderful with children, she said, but when reality becomes unpleasant, he waits for someone else to carry it. I asked whether that someone had always been her. She answered, first me, then you, then Marcus. For the first time, I understood that her resentment toward me was not only greed. She saw my money as the reason Ethan never had to grow up. Understanding did not equal forgiveness. I asked whether she had authorized the use of my signature. Claire's fingers tightened around her cup. The electronic signature came from the original lease package. She said, Marcus's attorney inserted it into the memorandum. I asked whether she knew. She stared out the window. I knew before it was filed. She admitted. I told them you would sign once the refinancing was approved. When I reminded her that I had never agreed to the price, she said she believed I would accept it rather than let BrightPath collapse. You always step in, she said. You complain afterward, but you step in. Her certainty hurt because I had trained her to expect exactly that. Every time I solved a crisis without conditions, I had taught my family that my boundaries were temporary obstacles. Claire had crossed a line, but I had spent years drawing lines in pencil. I asked whether she knew Marcus intended to collect $145,000 in fees. Her face changed. Not dramatically, but enough. She had known about a consulting fee, she said, but not that amount. I asked whether she had seen the final distribution schedule. She claimed Marcus told her it was still being revised. Then I asked about Cincinnati. Claire went still. The draft schedule's expansion account referenced a second location there, and Sophie had mentioned papers at their house. Claire admitted Marcus planned to open a branch under a new company controlled by Vale Capital. She and Ethan would relocate after the loan closed, while BrightPath's original location would remain under hired management. It was supposed to give us a fresh start, she said. I asked whether Ethan knew they were expected to move. She answered that he knew it was possible. That was not what Sophie had said. Claire had not only hidden the structure from me, she had rationed information to everyone, giving each person only enough truth to keep them moving. When I returned to Denise's office, we began building a plan. Filing suit immediately might stop the loan, but it would also allow Marcus to invoke default provisions and seize BrightPath's accounts and equipment. Instead, Denise proposed that I appear willing to negotiate the sale while demanding complete closing documents, contractor records, and a final distribution statement. Marcus needed my cooperation badly enough that he might provide the evidence himself. We would also notify the bank's counsel privately that ownership and guarantee issues existed. Without yet making public accusations, the bank would be forced to verify every representation. I asked whether that would protect the employees. Denise said nothing could guarantee it, but exposing the false numbers before closing was safer than allowing the loan to fund. We also needed an alternative operator ready in case BrightPath lost Marcus's financing. I thought of Midwest Children's Health Cooperative, a non-profit network that had once asked Ethan about a partnership. He had rejected them because Claire feared losing control. I contacted the cooperative's regional director, Dr. Naomi Pierce, and described the situation without sharing confidential patient information. Naomi remembered BrightPath and said the center's clinical reputation was strong despite its financial instability. If the property remained available and the legal issues could be resolved, the cooperative might lease the building, retain qualified staff, and place operations under independent management. Ethan would not control the business, and Claire would not control the finances, but the children would continue receiving care. It was not the future they had imagined, yet it was a future. When I presented the idea to Ethan, he reacted as though I had proposed taking his child. You want to hand our center to strangers, he said. I replied that Marcus was already taking it, except he intended to charge them for the privilege. Ethan accused me of using the crisis to prove I had always known better. I told him I would gladly be wrong if he could show me a plan that did not depend on forged consent and inflated invoices. That argument ended with Ethan walking out. 2 hours later, BrightPath's social media page posted a statement claiming its facility was under threat from a private landlord reconsidering long-standing family commitments. The post did not name me, But Columbus was not large enough for anonymity to survive details. Parents began sharing it. A local neighborhood group identified me as the owner. Comments called me greedy, vindictive, and willing to displace disabled children over rent. Marcus gave a statement to a small business newsletter praising Claire and Ethan for resisting last-minute pressure from a related party. I had spent decades earning a reputation for reliability. Yet one carefully worded post made me look like a bitter old man demanding money from a therapy center. Linda urged me to respond publicly. Denise told me not to. They want an emotional statement they can use. She said, "Silence is painful, but it preserves your options." For the first time in my life, doing nothing felt harder than writing a check. The damage reached beyond embarrassment. A community development group reviewing my senior housing renovation postponed its vote because of the property dispute. A former colleague called to ask whether I had misrepresented collateral to a bank. At the grocery store, a woman I recognized from Bright Path stared at me and moved her cart away. I began to understand Marcus's real leverage. He did not need to own my building yet. He needed to make resistance costlier than surrender. Claire had provided the family story, and Marcus had turned it into pressure. That evening, I sat in my truck across from Bright Path and watched therapists leave after dark. They were innocent. The children were innocent. Even Sophie was trapped inside decisions made by adults who claimed to be protecting her. I nearly called Denise and told her to accept the $275,000 price. Losing equity seemed easier than watching everyone suffer. Then I remembered the distribution schedule. Surrender would not save them. It would only fund Marcus's exit. The next day, Ethan came to my house with a notarized affidavit. He placed it on the kitchen table and said Marcus required it to keep payroll funding active. In the affidavit, Ethan swore that I had repeatedly promised to sell the building for $275,000, and that Bright Path had relied on that promise when accepting investment. I asked whether he believed every sentence. He said the price had been discussed, though he could not identify when. I reminded him that the lease contained a valuation process, not a fixed price. Ethan's eyes filled with anger. If I refuse, Marcus freezes the account on Friday. He said, 17 people miss paychecks. Families lose appointments. What am I supposed to do? I answered. Tell the truth. He shook his head. Truth is easy when you have money. Then he signed the affidavit in front of me, using my own kitchen pen. That was the moment I stopped seeing him only as someone being manipulated. Fear explained his choice, but the hand holding the pen was his. After he left, I found Margaret's old sewing box in the study closet. Inside was a note she had written during her illness, tucked beneath spools of thread. It was not addressed to me, but the first line said, Walter believes protecting Ethan means removing every consequence before it arrives. I sat on the floor and read the rest. Margaret worried that our son had learned to confuse being loved with being rescued. She wrote that I was generous, loyal, and terrified of being unnecessary. Her words did not excuse Ethan, but they stripped away the last comfortable lie I had told myself. I had not caused the fraud. I had not forced Claire to conceal losses or Marcus to inflate costs, but I had helped create a family system in which everyone assumed I would absorb the final damage. My retaliation could not simply punish them. It had to end that system, even if ending it cost me the relationship I was trying to preserve. Denise filed a confidential notice with the bank disputing any personal guarantee and requested a formal verification meeting before closing. At the same time, we sent Marcus a letter stating that I was willing to discuss the sale if he produced the complete loan package, all valuation materials, and the final use of funds schedule. He replied within 4 hours, calling the request reasonable and suggesting a closing conference the following week. His speed told us he believed I was weakening. We let him believe it. Then another blow arrived. My bank suspended Bennett Property Holdings' credit line pending resolution of possible misrepresentation in the Bright Path transaction. The senior housing project removed me as a financial participant to protect its schedule. I lost a project I had spent 18 months developing, along with nearly $70,000 in preliminary costs. Marcus had not taken my building, but his paperwork had already taken something else I valued: my name. That night, Ethan called and asked whether I had contacted Bright Path's lender. I said I had protected myself from a guarantee I never signed. He accused me of triggering the credit freeze. Behind him, I could hear Claire crying and Sophie asking what was happening. Ethan said payroll might fail within days. If the center closes, this is on you, he told me. I wanted to remind him of every signature, every hidden loss, every document he had refused to read. Instead, I said, no, Son, what happens next belongs to everyone who made a choice. He hung up. Minutes later, Denise forwarded a message from the bank. Marcus had requested an emergency meeting and claimed I was suffering memory problems that impaired my capacity to honor prior commitments. Attached was Ethan's sworn affidavit. My son had not merely chosen the business over me. He had given Marcus a weapon designed to make my own mind part of the dispute. Marcus arrived at Denise's office wearing the same composed expression he had worn at the anniversary dinner. But this time he brought 2 attorneys and a physician's letter, suggesting I should undergo a cognitive evaluation before making irreversible financial decisions. The letter was not written by my doctor. It came from a consultant Marcus's firm had used in another dispute, and it cited Ethan's affidavit as evidence of recent memory problems. Denise read it once, placed it face down, and asked Marcus whether he intended to challenge my legal capacity. He smiled and said no one wanted conflict. Only certainty. I knew then that our plan had worked well enough to frighten him. He believed I might still agree to the sale. But he also wanted a weapon ready if I refused. I leaned back and said, I'm prepared to move forward, provided I see the final loan distribution and every document carrying my name. Marcus glanced at his attorneys. Claire watched me as if I had surrendered. Ethan looked relieved. None of them understood that surrender was exactly what I needed them to see. Marcus agreed to provide a closing package within 48 hours. But he added conditions. I would sign a confidentiality agreement, refrain from contacting BrightPath employees or parents, and acknowledge that my prior statements had created a family commitment to sell. Denise objected to the acknowledgement. I told her I was willing to review it. Claire's shoulders relaxed for the first time since the dispute began. After the meeting, she followed me into the hallway and said, "Thank you for finally thinking about Sophie instead of your pride." I nearly answered, but restraint had become part of the trap. I simply said I wanted the center protected. She touched my arm, a gesture that might once have felt affectionate, and told me everything could still be repaired. Her certainty reminded me how often she had mistaken silence for agreement. Ethan asked whether we could have dinner soon. Just the 2 of us. I said we would talk after the documents were complete. He nodded as though the worst had passed. In truth, the most dangerous part had just begun. The package arrived the next evening through a secure portal. Denise, her forensic accountant, and I reviewed it in her conference room until after midnight. Marcus had finally given us the final use of funds schedule. It confirmed the $350,000 repayment to Vail Capital and the $145,000 advisory fee. A separate exhibit granted Vail Capital a continuing management lien and the right to appoint 2 of 3 board members at BrightPath after closing. Ethan and Claire would keep their titles, but Marcus would control budgets, hiring, expansion, and any future sale. Another document transferred the Cincinnati opportunity to a new company in which Vail Capital owned 70%. Claire held 20%. Ethan held 10%. The original BrightPath would carry debt used to launch a second location it would not control. Marcus had built a structure that allowed him to recover his money, collect a fee, dominate both businesses, and blame my refusal if it collapsed before closing. Denise looked at the documents and said, "He finally put the whole machine on paper." The most useful exhibit was a contractor capitalization schedule. It listed every improvement to the Hawthorne Avenue building as money contributed by BrightPath, including the roof, electrical work, property taxes, and heating system I had paid for myself. Beside each item was an inflated figure matching the estimates Claire had requested. The schedule had been certified by Marcus and approved electronically by Claire. Ethan's initials appeared at the bottom of every page. The bank's underwriting notes referred to those improvements as evidence that BrightPath had already invested substantial equity into the property. Without them, the proposed valuation and loan-to-cost ratio weakened significantly. Denise told me we now had enough to force an internal fraud review. But if we moved too soon, Marcus could freeze operating funds before an alternative was ready. Brightpath had 10 days of payroll cash remaining. Dr. Naomi Pierce needed at least a week to obtain approval from the cooperative's board. We had to keep Marcus confident, keep Claire from discovering the non-profit plan, and keep Ethan from making another desperate choice. It was a narrow bridge, and every person crossing it distrusted the others. I signed a limited confidentiality agreement after Denise removed every clause that could be interpreted as admitting the sale price, or my consent. Marcus accepted it because he believed the closing was close. Then I sent him a carefully worded email stating that I was prepared in principle to transfer the building once the bank verified the accounting and the final settlement statement matched the package. I hated writing those words. They sounded like consent, even though Denise assured me they created none. Marcus responded with unusual warmth. He praised my commitment to family and scheduled the closing conference for the following Friday at the bank's downtown office. Claire sent a message saying Sophie would be proud that we had chosen peace. Ethan called and thanked me. I let him speak for several minutes without correcting his assumptions. He described plans for Cincinnati, a larger clinical program, and a house Claire had shown him online. That was how I learned he still did not know the move had been planned, as nearly certain Claire had told him it was only an option. She continued controlling each person through a different version of the future. While Marcus prepared to close, Naomi and I worked quietly on the alternative. Midwest Children's Health Cooperative would lease the building at market rent, assume selected operating obligations, and offer positions to Brightpath's therapists after independent credential review. The cooperative would not purchase the existing company or absorb Marcus's investment. It would create a new nonprofit program at the same location, allowing patient care to continue if Brightpath lost control. Ethan could apply for a supervised clinical role after completing governance training. Claire would not be offered financial authority. Naomi made no promises beyond that. Her board wanted proof that the property would remain stable and that no fraud claim could attach to the new lease. Denise drafted a contingent agreement that would take effect only if the proposed loan failed and Vail Capital's control rights were suspended or invalidated. It was not a rescue for Ethan's ownership. It was a rescue for the work being done inside the building. For the first time, I separated saving the mission from saving my son's position. Claire discovered part of the plan sooner than we expected. Naomi had toured the building months earlier, and one of Brightpath's administrative assistants recognized her when she returned after hours with an engineer. The assistant mentioned it to Claire the next morning. By noon, Claire was at my house, pounding on the front door with Ethan behind her. She entered before I invited them in and demanded to know whether I was handing Brightpath to the cooperative. I told her I was developing a contingency in case Marcus's financing failed. "You were never going to sell," she said. "You wanted us to expose everything so you could steal the business." I reminded her that I owned the building, not the therapy practice. She replied that without the building, the practice had no value. Ethan looked from her to me, finally understanding that both sides had plans he had not been told about. "Were you going to replace us?" he asked. I said I was trying to keep the center open if their transaction collapsed. He heard only the first half of the answer. Claire accused me of pretending to cooperate while planning their removal. I told her she had spent a year pretending I had approved a sale. "That is different," she said. "We were protecting something we built." I asked who we included, because the Cincinnati documents gave Marcus 70% and Ethan only 10%. Ethan turned toward her. "What documents?" he asked. Claire went pale. She claimed the percentages were preliminary. I told Ethan the original center would carry debt used to finance a new company controlled by Vail Capital. He demanded to see the papers. Claire told him I was distorting them. Their argument moved from my living room into the driveway, where Sophie sat in the back seat of their car watching through the window. Ethan asked whether Claire had already selected a house in Cincinnati. She said she had only researched neighborhoods. He asked why Sophie had been told they were moving. Claire looked at me with pure hatred, not because I had lied, but because I had ended her ability to distribute truth in controlled portions. That evening, Marcus exercised his emergency authority under the control agreement. He removed Brightpath's longtime accountant, Ruth Delgado, claiming she had shared confidential financial information with unauthorized parties. Ruth had supplied Denise with copies of records only after discovering my name on vendor guarantees. But Marcus portrayed her dismissal as protection against sabotage. He also suspended Ethan's access to company banking and gave Claire sole operational authority under his supervision. Ethan called me from the parking lot. Furious. "You forced his hand," he said. I told him Marcus had been waiting for an excuse to take control. Ethan said Ruth's firing had frightened the staff and that 3 therapists were considering leaving. The consequences were spreading exactly as Denise had warned. Our alternative could save positions later, but it could not erase panic now. I asked Ethan to preserve any documents still on his laptop. He said Marcus had ordered all company files returned. I told him not to destroy or alter anything. "You think I'm a criminal now?" he asked. I answered, "I think fear has made you sign things you knew were wrong." Ruth met us at Denise's office the next morning. She brought a personal notebook containing dates, invoice numbers, and instructions Claire had given her over the previous year. She had not stolen company data. She had recorded concerns as part of her professional practice. Her notes confirmed that Claire instructed staff to classify my payments as Bright Path capital contributions. More importantly, Ruth remembered Marcus directing her to treat advisory fees as transaction costs rather than related party payments. Denise said the notebook strengthened our case, but it was not the decisive evidence. We already had the certified schedules and distribution plan. Ruth also told us payroll would fail in 6 days unless Marcus released another advance. Marcus had conditioned that release on the loan closing. The deadline was no longer artificial pressure. Employees would genuinely suffer if the transaction stopped without replacement funding. Naomi's board meeting was scheduled 2 days before closing, leaving almost no room for delay. I offered to cover one payroll personally. Denise refused to let me do it informally. "That is the exact pattern we are trying to end," she said. "We structured a temporary payroll reserve through Bennett Property Holdings, but only as part of the cooperative's contingent lease and only if independent management took control. I would not write another check to Claire or Marcus." Naomi's board accepted the concept, though several members worried about public backlash. BrightPath's social media statement had painted me as a landlord using children as leverage, and the cooperative did not want to appear complicit. I agreed to provide the full documentation under confidentiality. After reviewing the invoices, forged-looking memorandum, and loan schedule, Naomi said, "The public story is almost the opposite of the financial story." I told her public stories often belong to whoever spoke first. Her board approved the lease contingency by a narrow vote, provided the bank halted the transaction and BrightPath's clinical licenses could be transferred or maintained without interruption. We now had a path to preserve services and payroll. It was not guaranteed, but it meant Marcus could no longer hold innocent people entirely hostage. For the first time since dinner, I felt the balance shift. Marcus sensed it too. 2 days before closing, he sent the bank an audio recording from a family barbecue held 18 months earlier. In the recording, I could be heard telling Ethan, "One day, all of this will belong to you." The sound quality was poor, but the sentence was clear. Marcus's attorney argued that the statement confirmed my intent to transfer the building at a family price. Denise said, spoken intent could support their narrative, but could not replace the lease, deed, valuation clause, or my signature at closing. Still, the recording complicated matters. If litigation followed, Marcus could portray the dispute as a father reversing a gift after the family relied on it. I remembered the barbecue. Ethan had been standing near the therapy garden, and I had meant that he might inherit my property someday if he proved capable of managing it. Claire must have recorded the conversation on her phone. The realization was more painful than the legal issue. Even our warmest moments had apparently become material she might need later. Denise advised changing strategy. We would not argue that I had never intended Ethan to own the building. That was too broad and emotionally vulnerable. We would acknowledge that I hoped he might own it someday, then demonstrate that hope was conditional and unrelated to the current transaction. The issue was not whether I loved my son enough to offer favorable terms. The issue was whether Marcus and Claire could inflate costs, attach my assets, and extract $500,000 through documents I had not approved. By accepting the truth inside their best evidence, we removed its power. I recorded a formal statement for the bank I had expressed a future intention. But no sale price had been fixed. No personal guarantee had been granted. And no permission had been given to reuse my signature or financial information. Denise attached the original lease and my estate planning correspondence, which showed the building remained part of my property company. Marcus wanted a dispute about memory and family promises. We forced it back into records, numbers, and authorization. The night before the closing conference, Ethan came to my house alone. He looked thinner than he had 2 weeks earlier. He said Claire had taken Sophie to her sister's home after another argument. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. Are you going to destroy everything I told him I was going to stop a loan built on false information? He said the result might be the same. I explained the cooperative plan, including the payroll reserve and the possibility that most employees would keep their jobs. His first reaction was relief. His second was humiliation. What happens to me, he asked. I said he could apply for a supervised clinical position but would not control the center. He stared at the floor. So Marcus takes it. Or you take it, I replied. No. The difference is that Marcus takes the value for himself. The cooperative protects the work without rewarding the people who lied. Ethan asked whether Claire would have any role. I said not in finance. He nodded slowly, as though a future he had resisted was becoming the only honest one left. Before leaving, Ethan admitted Claire had asked him to sign an emergency voting authorization giving Marcus full control if the bank delayed closing. He had signed it that morning. I felt anger rise, but he continued before I could speak. He had also downloaded the final authorization packet and noticed a clause allowing Marcus to sell BrightPath's assets to an affiliated company after default. Ethan finally understood that Marcus could close the original center, move selected programs to Cincinnati, and leave the Columbus debts behind. He forwarded the packet to Denise while sitting at my kitchen table. It was not a new decisive revelation. The earlier control agreement had already shown Marcus's authority, but the packet confirmed how he planned to use it if the loan failed. Ethan asked whether helping us now changed anything. I told him it changed what he did next, not what he had already done. He accepted that answer without protest. It was the first adult response I had heard from him in weeks. On Friday morning, I dressed in the same charcoal suit I had worn to Margaret's funeral. It was not a gesture of revenge. It reminded me that love and loss often occupy the same room. I placed the original invoices, contractor emails, lease, distribution schedule, Ruth's notes, and disputed memorandum into the gray document box. Denise carried certified copies and the cooperative's contingent lease. At the bank's downtown office, Marcus arrived with his attorneys. Claire wore a cream-colored suit and held herself with rigid confidence. Ethan came separately and sat at the far end of the table. Representatives from the bank, its fraud review unit, and an independent auditor joined us. Marcus opened by saying the purpose of the meeting was to resolve final questions and complete a transaction essential to 80 families. Then he looked at me and added, Walter has graciously agreed to honor his commitment. I rested both hands on the gray box and said, I agreed to let the bank see what everyone has been calling a commitment. The auditor asked for the original evidence supporting BrightPath's capital contributions. Marcus's attorney produced the inflated schedule. Claire certified that it accurately reflected improvements made for the center. The auditor then asked who had paid the contractors. Marcus said the source of payment was less important than the family's economic intent. I opened the box and placed the first original invoice on the table. The source becomes important, I said. When someone uses my money as their equity and my property as their collateral. Claire's eyes moved toward Marcus. Ethan stared at his hands. One by one. I arranged the heating bill, roof invoice, tax receipts, and bank records beside the numbers submitted to the lender. The room became so quiet I could hear the auditor's calculator keys. Marcus interrupted, saying the differences reflected expanded scopes and fair value adjustments. Denise slid Paul Granger's email across the table, showing that the optional heating work had never been performed. The bank's fraud officer asked Marcus why Vale Capital's $145,000 fee had been described in an earlier summary as expansion capital. Marcus objected that the meeting was becoming adversarial. The officer replied that a $900,000 loan supported by disputed collateral was already adversarial. Claire whispered something to her attorney. Ethan looked at me, and for once he did not ask me to stop. I placed the recorded memorandum beside my old construction contract and pointed out the identical scanning defect in the copied signature. Denise then presented my formal denial of authorization. Marcus claimed outside counsel had handled the electronic execution. His attorney immediately clarified that his firm had not prepared that filing. The separation between them happened in a single sentence. Marcus had expected family pressure to keep every participant aligned. Once the bank began asking individual questions, each person started protecting themselves. Claire's confidence finally cracked when the auditor asked whether she had known the signature was reused before the memorandum was filed. Before she answered, the bank's senior lending officer closed the loan binder and announced that no documents would be signed that day. The transaction was suspended pending a full review of the valuation, guarantees, related party fees, and disputed authorization. Marcus stood and warned that Bright Path would miss payroll because of the bank's delay. That was the moment Denise placed the cooperative's contingent lease and payroll reserve agreement on the table. Services could continue under independent management if Vale Capital withheld operating funds. Marcus's threat had lost its strongest target. He could still damage Ethan and Claire. He could still litigate. But he could no longer claim that children and employees depended on paying him $500,000. Claire looked at the cooperative documents, then at me, and understood that I had not come merely to block the sale. I had built a way around her. The fraud officer turned back to her and repeated the question about my signature. Every person in the room waited for her answer. Claire did not answer immediately. She looked at Marcus, then at Ethan, then down at the copied signature lying beside the original construction contract. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed unable to decide which version of the truth would protect her best. The fraud officer repeated the question. Did you know Walter Bennett's electronic signature had been reused before the memorandum was filed? Claire pressed her lips together and said, I knew a signature from the lease package had been inserted, but I was told it was temporary until Walter signed the final sale documents. Marcus's attorney leaned toward him and whispered. The bank's senior lending officer asked who had given that assurance. Claire answered, Marcus. He immediately denied it. Their partnership did not collapse with shouting. It collapsed through careful sentences, each one placing responsibility on the other. I watched Ethan's face as he realized the two people he had trusted to manage reality were now rewriting it in front of him. Marcus said Claire had misunderstood routine transactional drafting and insisted Vale Capital had relied on information supplied by Brightpath. Claire turned toward him. You told me Walter would never let the center fail, she said. You said the signature only documented what he had already promised. Marcus replied that she had certified every financial schedule and authorized the filing. The auditor asked whether the inflated contractor amounts represented completed work. Claire admitted some figures included proposed additions, but claimed Marcus's team had instructed her to use full project value. Paul Granger's email proved the heating additions had never been approved, performed, or paid. The roof and electrical records showed the same pattern. Marcus stopped calling the differences estimates and began calling them valuation adjustments. The fraud officer asked why valuation adjustments had been presented as past capital contributions. He had no clean answer. The figures that once looked like complicated finance now looked painfully simple. I had paid $18,640, and someone had told the bank Brightpath paid $27,900. The lending officer suspended the application indefinitely and said the bank would refer the disputed representations to its internal investigations department. He also ordered that no account connected to the proposed loan receive or disperse funds until ownership, authorization, and related party payments were verified. Marcus objected that the bank was endangering patient care. Naomi Pierce, who had been waiting in an adjacent conference room, entered after Denise signaled her. She explained that Midwest Children's Health Cooperative had approved a contingent operating plan, including temporary payroll funding, subject to independent access to clinical records and immediate separation between Vale Capital and daily operations. Marcus accused me of orchestrating a hostile takeover. Naomi answered, "The cooperative is not purchasing Brightpath or taking its brand. We are offering continuity of care at this location if the current company cannot operate responsibly." That distinction mattered. I was not stealing Ethan's business. I was refusing to let his business use children as a shield for financial misconduct. Marcus tried one last form of pressure. He opened the control agreement and announced that Vale Capital had authority to remove management, freeze discretionary spending, and liquidate assets after default. Denise slid Ethan's emergency authorization packet beside it and pointed to the affiliated sale clause. She asked Marcus to explain why Brightpath's equipment could be transferred to a company controlled by Vale Capital, while the original center remained responsible for its debts. He said the clause was standard protection. The fraud officer asked whether the proposed Cincinnati company had been disclosed to the bank as a related party. Marcus hesitated. The final loan schedule listed it only as an expansion affiliate. Without ownership percentages, Ethan spoke before anyone else could. "He owns 70%, he said. Claire closed her eyes. Marcus stared at him. Ethan continued. "Claire owns 20. I own 10. Brightpath was going to borrow the money, but the new company would own the expansion." It was not a dramatic confession, but it changed the room. My son had finally chosen truth before knowing what it would cost him. The bank's counsel requested copies of every agreement involving Vale Capital, Brightpath, and the Cincinnati entity. Marcus refused to volunteer documents beyond those already submitted. But the damage was done. His greatest assets had been complexity and urgency. The invoices removed complexity. The cooperative removed urgency. Without those protections, he was only an investor demanding repayment, a large fee, and control based on information no one could defend. His attorney asked for a recess. During the break, Claire approached Ethan near the windows. I could not hear every word, but I heard her say, "You just destroyed us." Ethan answered, "No, we did that before today." She slapped the folder against her leg, then looked toward me. I expected accusation. Instead, she asked whether Sophie would lose her school and home. I told her I was not taking their house and had no authority over Sophie's school. Consequences would come, but I was not interested in inventing extra ones. Claire seemed confused by that. She had prepared for revenge, not limits. When the meeting resumed, the bank formally declined to proceed with the loan under the existing application. It did not declare anyone guilty of fraud. That determination belonged to investigators, courts, and regulators if the evidence warranted it. But the practical result was immediate. Vale Capital would receive no $350,000 repayment, no $145,000 advisory fee, and no financing for Cincinnati. The proposed purchase of my building was dead. The bank also released a written statement confirming that I had disputed the guarantee before closing and had not authorized my personal assets for the transaction. Denise sent that letter to my lenders before we left the conference room. My suspended credit line would not reopen immediately, and the senior housing project was already lost. But my name was no longer trapped beneath an unresolved application. Marcus had tried to make resistance more expensive than surrender. He had succeeded in costing me money. He had failed to make the lie permanent. Vale Capital responded that afternoon by withholding further operating advances and issuing default notices against Brightpath. Marcus removed Claire from financial authority, though he did so to protect himself rather than punish her. The cooperative's contingent agreement then activated. Bennett Property Holdings leased the Hawthorne Avenue property to Midwest Children's Health Cooperative under a new 10-year lease at a fair but manageable rate. The cooperative funded payroll through the reserve Denise and I had structured, and most of Brightpath's therapists received provisional offers while licenses, insurance contracts, and patient consents were transferred. The transition was messy. 2 therapists left. Several families moved to other providers. Appointments were canceled for 3 days while systems were secured. There was no magical moment when everyone applauded. Real rescue looked like conference calls, frightened employees, boxes of records, and Naomi standing in the lobby explaining to parents why care would continue under a different name. The new program became Hawthorne Children's Therapy. Operated by the cooperative, Bright Path Therapy Center remained a legal entity burdened by disputes, debts, and Vail Capital's investment claim, but it no longer controlled the building or patient services. Marcus filed a civil action seeking repayment from Ethan and Claire under their investment agreements. Denise filed claims on behalf of Bennett Property Holdings challenging the memorandum, unauthorized use of my signature, and misrepresentation of property contributions. Greenwell Pediatric Equipment withdrew its demand against me after reviewing the guarantee history and redirected its claim toward Bright Path. The county recorder accepted our affidavit disputing the purchase memorandum, and a judge later ordered the document released from the property record, pending resolution of the underlying claims. None of those outcomes arrived overnight, but each one followed from evidence already sitting inside the gray box original invoices. Dates, payments, the copied signature, and the agreements Marcus had produced when he thought I was ready to surrender. Claire resigned from Bright Path before Marcus could formally terminate her. The cooperative declined to offer her a financial role. She cooperated with the bank's review and provided emails showing that Marcus had instructed her to use full projected improvement values. But those emails did not erase her own certifications. Her attorney negotiated with vendors and Vail Capital while she searched for work outside healthcare finance. She and Ethan separated within a month. She moved into a rented apartment near Sophie's school rather than Cincinnati. I never asked Ethan to leave her. Their marriage had been built around a division of responsibility that allowed both of them to avoid uncomfortable truths. Claire controlled everything, and Ethan claimed not to know. Once that arrangement collapsed, they had to decide whether anything honest remained underneath it. Their separation was painful for Sophie, and that pain belonged partly to every adult involved, including me. Victory did not make it disappear. Ethan resigned as clinical director. Naomi offered him a temporary therapist position under supervision, but only after he completed governance and ethics training and signed an agreement barring him from financial authority. He nearly refused. He said working in the same building without his title would feel like public humiliation. I told him humility and humiliation often look alike from inside a wounded ego. He did not appreciate the remark, but a week later he accepted. The first morning he returned, he wore plain blue scrubs instead of the sport coat he once used for donor meetings. He treated 4 patients, completed his notes, and left without entering the administrative offices. For the first time in years, his job was simply the work he was good at. He did not control expansion, payroll, or strategy. He could not hide behind Claire or depend on me to cover mistakes. The limits made him smaller in title and steadier in practice. Sophie avoided me for several weeks. Claire had told her I had taken the center, while Ethan told her the adults had made mistakes. Neither explanation was enough for a 14-year-old whose family and routines had changed. Eventually, she asked to visit my house. We sat at the kitchen table where Ethan had signed the affidavit, and she asked whether I hated her mother. I said no. I told her I hated some choices Claire had made, but people were larger than their worst choices even when consequences remained necessary. Sophie asked why I had not simply given them the building, since I had enough money to live. I explained that the issue was no longer generosity once my name, savings, and property were used without permission. Helping someone is a choice. I told her, taking away the choice changes what it is. She thought about that, then asked whether her father was a criminal. I said investigations and courts would decide legal labels. But Ethan had signed things he should not have signed and would have to live honestly with that. Marcus's reputation suffered more than his finances at first. The bank circulated an internal risk notice concerning Vail Capital's documentation practices. 2 other medical practices paused negotiations with him after learning of the dispute through public filings. His civil case against Bright Path exposed the related party fee and Cincinnati ownership structure, details he had preferred to keep buried in transactional language. He was not arrested in a dramatic scene, nor did he lose everything overnight. Months later, Vail Capital settled several claims, waived part of its asserted fees, and accepted a reduced repayment schedule funded only from remaining Bright Path assets. not my building or retirement accounts. Marcus lost the control premium he valued most. He could recover part of his principal through legal channels, but he could no longer dictate the future of the Hawthorne property, the therapy program, or my family. His punishment was proportionate and, in some ways, more fitting than ruin. People who once trusted his confidence began reading every line he placed before them. Claire faced consequences of a different kind. The state licensing board for her professional credential reviewed her financial conduct but did not permanently bar her from employment because she was not a licensed accountant or clinician. She accepted a non-management billing position at a large hospital system, where approvals required multiple signatures and independent audits. When we eventually spoke, she said the job felt insulting after running BrightPath. I replied that systems with oversight can feel insulting only to people accustomed to controlling all the information. She accepted that without arguing. Then she apologized for the anniversary dinner. I told her the insult had hurt, but it was not the deepest betrayal. You knew I had not agreed. I said, you counted on my love for Ethan to make agreement unnecessary. Claire's eyes filled. She said, I thought success would make the method irrelevant. I answered, that is what people say when the method has already become the plan. We did not reconcile, but we stopped pretending misunderstanding had caused everything. My own losses remained. The $70,000 tied to the senior housing project did not return. The project moved forward with another investor, and I watched its groundbreaking in the local news without being invited. Some acquaintances continued believing I had nearly evicted a children's therapy center. Public corrections never travel as far as public accusations. Denise advised against releasing confidential records merely to restore my reputation. And I agreed. The people whose opinions mattered most eventually learned enough. Paul Granger knew. Linda knew. Naomi and the cooperative board knew. The bank's letter restored my standing with lenders. But not every dinner invitation. I had to accept that defending myself did not guarantee universal understanding. That was another boundary I had never learned. I could control my actions and documentation. Not everyone's version of me. I revised my estate plan before the year ended. Bennett Property Holdings remained under my control, with Denise and an independent fiduciary named as successor managers if I became incapacitated. The Hawthorne building would eventually pass into a trust benefiting Sophie and charitable pediatric services. But no beneficiary could pledge or sell it without independent approval. Ethan would not receive direct control merely because he was my son. I established a smaller education trust for Sophie and removed provisions that automatically transferred other commercial assets to Ethan. When I told him, he did not accuse Claire or ask me to reconsider. He said, I understand why. The sentence was quiet, almost painful, but it meant more than the dramatic apologies he had offered during the crisis. Understanding did not restore trust. It created the first condition under which trust might someday return. Ethan apologized properly several months after the closing meeting. We were sitting on a bench outside Hawthorne Children's Therapy while Sophie volunteered inside. He did not begin by saying he had been pressured. He said, I took your financial information because I knew you would refuse. I signed documents I did not read because not knowing felt easier than disagreeing with Claire. Then I blamed you when the consequences arrived. He admitted that helping children had become his moral excuse for avoiding every business responsibility. I told him I had spent years praising his compassion while rescuing him from the discipline compassion required. I made it easier for you to stay dependent. I said, but I did not make those signatures. He nodded. We left both truths between us. That was the closest we had come to honesty since Margaret died. I also apologized for the father I had been. I told Ethan I had mistaken provision for presence and then used financial rescue to remain important after he grew up. I had not demanded gratitude aloud, but part of me expected money to purchase closeness. When Claire accused me of turning generosity into debt, she had twisted the truth, yet she had not invented it entirely. Some of my giving carried an unspoken hope that Ethan would need me, consult me, and forgive the years I missed. Love, offered with invisible conditions, can become confusing even when the money is freely given. I promised I would no longer solve his problems before he faced them. I would help in emergencies involving health or Sophie's safety. but not finance businesses, cover debts, or sign guarantees. Ethan said the new boundaries felt harsh. I told him they felt harsh because we had lived without them for too long. By spring, the heating system at Hawthorne Children's Therapy was running quietly through another cold Ohio morning. I visited to sign a routine property inspection report and found Sophie in the lobby organizing sensory toys for younger children. Ethan was in a treatment room helping a boy learn to climb 2 padded steps. He saw me through the glass and raised one hand, then returned his attention to the child. Naomi's office occupied the room Claire once used. The framed expansion renderings were gone. In their place hung a monthly financial dashboard visible to department leaders, with expenses, revenue, and reserves listed plainly. Nothing depended on one person controlling all the answers. The building was less glamorous than Claire had imagined for Cincinnati, but it was stable, transparent, and useful. For the first time, that felt like enough. I kept the gray document box in my study. Inside were the original heating invoice, the roof bill, the tax receipts, the memorandum with the copied signature, and Margaret's note from the sewing box. I did not keep them as trophies. They reminded me that facts often look ordinary before someone needs them. A total at the bottom of a page, a payment date, a name in a footer, a signature carrying the scar of an old scanner. Claire had announced that they would not repay me, believing the bills represented only money I had chosen to spend. She did not understand that the bills also preserved the boundary everyone else had tried to erase. They showed who paid, who owned, who claimed, and who lied. I never recovered the family we had before that dinner, because that family had depended on too many polite silences. Ethan and I now met for breakfast twice a month. Claire and I spoke only when Sophie's needs required it. She and Ethan began counseling but remained separated, uncertain whether rebuilding their marriage was wise or possible. Sophie spent time with both parents and stopped treating my house like enemy territory. None of us returned to innocence. We became something less comfortable and more honest. I had regained control of the building, cleared my name with the bank, protected my retirement, and prevented Marcus from extracting the money he expected. But the most important thing I recovered was the right to let people I loved face consequences, without mistaking that choice for abandonment. Margaret had once written that I feared being unnecessary. She was right. For years, I believed a father proved his love by standing beneath every falling weight. What I learned too late was that constantly catching the weight can prevent everyone else from building strength. The night Claire said, "We're not paying you back," she thought she was freeing her family from an old man's expectations. In a way, she did. I stopped expecting gratitude to repair what money could not. I stopped calling rescue the same thing as love. And I stopped paying bills that allowed other people to avoid the truth. The heating invoice remained $18,640. The cost of learning what it meant was much higher. But for once, I paid it only once.